You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations about ending things and collective liberation. On this episode, I talked with Aidan Khamis, a Palestinian student at Indiana University Bloomington. We talk about the student encampment established on the campus in solidarity with Gaza and still existent as of the recording of this episode. Aidan gives a rundown of the initial stages of setting the camp up, the waves of violent repression from the administration and police, as well as the positive experiences of worldbuilding, collective study, and solidarity. We go on to a deep and wide-ranging conversation about the tactic of encampment, the parallel of police repression and the apartheid state in occupied Palestine, the left's colonial reservations about resistance, different fronts of the decolonial struggle, and the possibilities of solidarity in the heart of empire. I'm excited to share this conversation. Aidan had brilliant insights and makes really beautiful connections as we talk. This solidarity movement is now on a turning point as most encampments have been packed up or evicted, and we move into summer where life on campus slows down. There's much to learn from the experiences that student and faculty had together, and we don't know yet how the seeds planted in these experiences will sprout in further forms of resistance to genocide, empire, capital, and the police state. I hope that sharing this experience that Aidan tells us about and his insights will help sprout more possibilities. Aidan shared with me 2 sites to support a GoFundMe for his close friends and family, as well as a site where his friend posts e-poetry that he's using to help evacuate his family. I will drop both those links in the show notes. Please support how you can. If you like this show, please share with your friends and rate and follow us wherever you get podcasts. You can also support the project and my writing by subscribing to my Patreon, patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. If you have any extra cash, you can sign up for $5 a month, though nothing there is paywalled. On the Patreon, I regularly post short and long written pieces, all the episodes of The Breakup Theory, and then other conversations I'm having. I'm so grateful for all of you who support me in this project. And as always, we have an online submission form at form.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories and a phone line at 917-426-6548. Please write and call us to share your breakup stories, your questions about ending things, and your hopes for liberation. We love to hear from you. And now my conversation with Aidan. So, just to start off our conversation, would you mind introducing yourself with whatever name you want to use, if you want to tell me pronouns, and sort of where you're coming from? Anything you associate with politically or identity-wise?
Yeah, so my name is Aidan. I'm a student at Indiana University. I'm an organizer. I'm also happen to be Palestinian. Yeah, and I'm just happy to be here talking with you.
Cool. Yeah, I'm so excited. So we, set up this conversation with the starting point of you kind of giving a rundown of what has gone on at Indiana University in Bloomington in terms of Gaza solidarity encampments. Can you just start us off with just like the kind of details?
Yeah, so essentially we started out in late April with our encampment. We saw that Colombia started theirs and it got the ball rolling in that sense, and we felt the need and like that. It was a really good opportunity for us to, act on behalf of Gaza, on behalf of Palestine. And so we set up our encampment with our demands of divestment, of ending Ukraine partnership or our school's partnership with a naval base, and then the resignation of faculty members who I like to say have gone above and beyond, or not faculty, but administration members, so I like to say have gone above and beyond in serving crimes against humanity. But we set up our encampment, and it was pretty successful initially, but within a few hours we did receive state troopers, Indiana State Police, and had our first raid within that first day. And it was an interesting confrontation. I can't lie, I felt a lot like being back in Palestine, because we had the confrontation of militarized police, or it was as if the IOF were in the city, and then you had Zionists on the side, either dancing or cheering the police on. So it was a bizarre space, but I think most of what was so profound was most of these students were, so necessarily committed to their solidarity to Gaza that they weathered the storm. We had 33 students initially arrested, but then the encampment stayed up. It was after that we had a day of kind of quiet, the police would be around, so on and so forth. But the next day they returned with even more. They returned with SWAT. They had snipers on our roofs. They had a Bearcat and so on and so forth. And that day I got arrested, so there was 22 of us. And again, it was similar things, There was obviously annoying that the school felt the need to send, militarized police, but in my personal view, it's no shocker. I always like to say that these institutions in the US aren't only really complicit in genocide when you're sending the bombs, yourselves, you're a full-blown partner. I mean, you're participating. And so that day I got arrested, but the encampment stayed up. And now we have weathered those two major events. We have weathered other Issues in the front of police and harassment and so on and so forth. And we're on, I think, day 38 of our encampment. It's been good. I mean, it's quiet to a certain degree too, because this is a state school and there's not a lot of people around, but there is a good amount of group, and it's really kind of transformed into, again, a popular thing. We've had a lot of community members bring their families and so on and so forth, and had teach-ins and demonstrated. And it's been profound in the sense that, it's awakened a certain level of consciousness in the school. And that was really the goal. The goal was to have our material demands be met, but we understand that there is a strategy to that this encampment is a tactic towards that, and one tactic in a large plethora of tactics. But we both had a wide variety of students gain a certain level of political consciousness, when the school unveiled the mask of what it's willing to do to preserve its movement of capital. And we still had, gains to a certain degree. We have faculty more unified on certain front against this administration. Prior, this administration had been voted no confidence, by huge margins. I think upwards of 90% our president got voted no confidence by the faculty. And it was on top of that the president chose to send state troopers and state police down to the students. So it's part of building. It was a mass mobilizing effect, and that students and faculty now with a different consciousness are ready to move forward and furthering demands, for the most part successfully furthering demands on behalf of Palestine. We know we have other people within movements of solidarity that kind of have their own agenda, but it's really our endeavor is to lead the way. And so that in the event that someone is not fully in support of Gaza, to which we're doing everything for, that's the purpose of the encampment. It's the purpose of our solidarity. It's the purpose of everything that we're doing. They are forced to be behind us. If we are the ones leading the way, those who are not clear on their path will inevitably follow.
Well, yeah, thank you for all that sort of to set the ground. And that's amazing that y'all are still up, because a lot of the encampments have either been totally evicted or, kind of dwindled down through some sort of concession seemingly made by the administration, like towards, like at the new school where I had been involved. The faculty finally took their encampment down when they said the board of trustees will vote on divestment, even though everyone sort of knew that it's unlikely that they'll vote yes. The kind of tactic seemed to have maybe lost its effectiveness, and also we were just there was so many cops all the time just surrounding it. So yeah, that's just amazing that y'all are still up, because I think that the continuation of it, especially into the summer past the confines of the semester, opens up a new possibility. My first question though is, because I'm interested in what you were talking about in terms of community members coming in, because some of the encampments have been open to people who are not part of the school, and some of them haven't, right? At the new school, you had to swipe in to be at the encampments, or the initial one. Other ones, it wasn't like that. But and then Columbia, the police, then the school really tried to lock it down, although people kept finding ways to get in. So I was wondering just about the kind of relationship between the school and the surrounding area in Bloomington, and also if before this kicked off there had been a kind of robust Palestinian solidarity movement in the town that was in relation to what you all were doing on campus?
Yeah, I mean, I think loosely, so Bloomington as a city is kind of siloed from the rest of Indiana. And so it's an interesting dynamic. I think in terms of a Palestine solidarity movement prior to the encampment, like convinced it was there. There were different moving parts, but it really became more salient after the encampment. And it's for a multitude of reasons. Like people felt the opportunity to get involved, the opportunity to come out. But our campus is a public campus, so it's really open. And it's interesting because the way that the school punished after students getting arrested was 57 of us were banned from campus. Thankfully, by now, all of that has been rescinded and the charges have been dropped or dismissed. But it's a really open space. So what we have our encampment is in a field that is referred to as Dunn Meadow. And it's chosen for a multitude of reasons. I mean, it's used a lot for events and so on and so forth. It's also used for a certain level of people just go out there, but it is also the place in which all the other encampments in the history of the school have been, for South Africa, for the war in Arab, and so on and so forth. And it's funny because, there's this whole like theory of legality from like a leftist standpoint, like we know how law is weaponized and so on and so forth. But we remember setting up the encampment that there was a certain policy about allowing free speech, within that frame, which I mean, for me, when I first heard of something called a free speech zone, I was like, what does that even mean? But, nonetheless, but it's funny because, again, this is the part of the political education that the night before we set up our encampment, the school set up an ad hoc committee to change the policy. It violates its own legality insofar as it's not, serving its continuance. So they changed it and they said no structures allowed in Dunn Meadow at any time during the day. And that was the pretext to which they used to evict, to do the raids, to bring down like militarized police. And I keep saying militarized police, and they brought down like everything. They had tear gas, grenade launchers. I think what's been popular from our school is the picture of the sniper on the roof. They brought down everything, riot gear, SWAT. But it really, it shows the insecurity, that they almost are perceiving the movement growing, that the movement is salient, and that action is a demonstration of their fear and their willingness to, like I said, violate their own legality, or legality insofar as it's not serving the continuance of them moving capital.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the ways I've thought about this is that it's sort of like there's a battle over reality and the brute force that the schools are willing to use, just like, cities and towns in terms of bringing down police against, masses of people saying this is a genocide and it has to stop by any means necessary. It shows how sort of weak their position is in a way, even though they have this overwhelming force, that that they need that to uphold their version of reality. And it's really interesting in the school setting because, like I've been in New York City where there was marches like all the time since October 7th, right? Like there's just been a lot of street activity and there's been a lot of crackdown by the police, but it wasn't turning into anything different, right? It was just a lot of marches. But once the stuff happened at Columbia, right? As soon as the president there brought in the police and violently arrested the students, that created a new situation, which obviously was like also inspiring to you in Indiana. And it sounds like they didn't learn from Columbia, Indiana. They did the same thing. They're like, we're going to brutally arrest these people and think that that will stop them. But it seems that likewise, in your instance, it just like invigorated the people's desire to stay there and, demand that they, I mean, I don't know. Like, I guess we could talk a little bit more about your specific demands, but because I think also maybe it goes beyond simply like divestment, right? Like you were saying, there's something else going there. But yeah, what do you think about that play between they're thinking that brutal repression is going to work and the fact that it just keeps not working? Why do they still commit to this pathway?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many angles to go about it, but one thing that really makes me think is like, it's Palestine. The idea that, the Zionists think that unleashing collective punishment on a population of people, ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth for 76 years is just going to lead to them saying, all right, let's get up and leave. You know what I mean? Like I say, every time the atrocities are raised, you build a more engaged and fiercer resistance. And that, that I think that like the resistance and is largely grounded. You know what I mean? It's grounded in really deep principles, like principles of liberation, life, and humanity, but also just principles deeply of the land, like a connection, a very indigenous connection to the land. And I think like that's where you see that differing, like being grounded and ungrounded. And like these factions, whether it be the Zionists or like American institutions or like largely in the West, like are just really grounded in the preservation of moving capital and like the systems that they created. And so like that means, when push comes to shove, they'll do anything possible to preserve that. And it's really obviously the more and more it gets more and more illogical. It's funny because it's always painted as, resistance or like students protesting or just people who generally tend to be on the right side of history are the illogical, emotional ones, but you really start to see, you start to see the level to which Israel is becoming more and more irrational, or the United States is becoming more and more irrational, like going as far as to say, well, we're gonna, sanction the ICC, things along those lines. And I think that holds similarly true in the university context. The only means they have or know to control a student movement is through violence, having them monopoly on violence. And I mean, for them, it's really about their willingness to cross political red lines. And I say, like, there's always talk about political red lines. And obviously, like in the case of Biden, it means absolutely nothing. But, I think in the case of our school, it's like important for understanding because those political red lines mean something to the mass of people. And it's all about what level the police are willing to go to repress students that are just going to get people more engaged. Like the idea that they brought state troopers down. Like I know how many people who are not invested in anything, but the idea that you're seeing militarized police on your campus, it also like puts into context in reality this level of seriousness about what's going on in Gaza. I mean, imperial boomerang. So I think it's that both and that this investment in capital becomes like such a diluting thing. It becomes like this thing where they're willing to do anything they can to preserve it. And so like the only means becomes in their view force, they're not thinking on the same level that we are, or in our context, with a whole being more grounded, being students, not having investments in these kind of things. And I also say like Indiana University, it's funny the dynamic between like conservative schools and like liberal schools. Like we know obviously they're both service of empire, but what I mean is like you'll see different schools take different routes. And I think Indiana University, being in a red state, being conservative, I always say like the conservative aspect is not like the thinking part of empire.
Right.
You know what I It's really like the naked, rabid, racism, violence, misogyny, which is critical to like the preservation of empire, like pushing forward the bounds, like on the boundaries, whereas like the liberal, mask is what is attempting to preserve it in a more conniving way. But there's almost like, in that sense, in this context, it's so much easier to gain political consciousness when you see the insanity like bare, and in that sense, that's really what I think why too, like adding on to the idea of they're already wanting to do anything they can to preserve, but the fact that they're, like I said, not the thinking part of empire, thinking that these tactics will work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much in what you just said that I want to pull out, but maybe starting right there. Like, I mean, I always go back to this line in Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, where he's like, the colonized people, they like see the kind of power of the empire through the like police baton, right? Like they live in a world of violence, whereas the colonizer is controlled through other methods, like institutions, like the university is one of the institutions that like keep the colonizer population in check. But what you said, the sort of experience of repression that people have faced in the encampments brings the violence that's actually how empire is upheld to the heart of the empire, where like people who haven't experienced that kind of brutal repression and the fact that the system itself is only really upheld in the end by violence, right? It's not upheld through a desire to do good for people in general, right? That seems so powerful. And maybe, yeah, I mean, maybe like you could talk a little bit about sort of, because you have a unique position, as you were saying, like it reminded you of things that you had experienced in Palestine. Could you talk a little bit about sort of, yeah, the relationship and that kind of means of solidarity between the encampment, the repressions and violence that people face there, and sort of what you've experienced in Palestine?
Yeah. I spent a little time in Palestine in a town called Al Bira, which is, right part of Ramallah in the West Bank. And so for me, I'm a Palestinian who's from northern occupied Palestine. Like my family's from Safad and Haifa. And most of my family was, dispossessed in the Nakba and live in refugee camps in Lebanon. But for me, I visited with my, friends and so on and so forth. And I got the experience of being there. And I have certain personal experiences through my family to which, inform my Palestinian identity. Just like, for example, my dad being under the siege of 82 and just, the losing family members are them being martyred and killed to that end, and then my grandparents dying before I was born. So there was in the camp. So there's those aspects that inform. But being in the West Bank, it was particularly interesting because, again, I was the first Palestinian in my family to return, which was hugely profound. And then I got to see the occupation firsthand. And, I got to see a lot of just the classical, like daily humiliation, the checkpoints and so on and so forth, the raids. Not necessarily to where I was, but, not far. There is Jalazon camp in Ramallah. I'd visited Nablus, saw that the IOF was everywhere. And so I kept saying in the encampment, like it was really a microcosm of Palestine. Because again, I said, like, you have the military force in front of you. And then, but also you get flanked on the side by the settlers, because that was another thing when I was in Palestine. You have these like settlers that are around that are just like rabid, and you have it lurking in the back of your mind that like, what are they gonna do? Is this the moment? So you do everything you can to kind of like stay away from them, or there's always like a tension. But in our context at the school, we had the Zionists just saying what I would expect them to say, sexual obscenities to people in our encampment, like cheering on the police, buddy with the state police, just saying racist things. And it's interesting because, again, you see where their ideology is built on colonialism and violence to the level of which what they're doing makes absolutely no sense. Because we had Zionists lined up against the encampment, and they were holding a Trump flag, a pride flag, and an Israeli flag. And I was just like, what is going on here? You know what I mean? But in that sense, like, that's where I was trying to really tell the other students and faculty, that this is a product of the investment in a settler colony in the Middle East. The idea that you can invest in settler colonialism, and not to say that we're not obviously on occupied land, but to say that the continual investment in the Zionist entity is not going to reap the same effects was part of the political education I was trying to get on. But I also tried to say too, like, it's a balancing act, because I want to say, like, this will affect you, but also those in Gaza are worth enough as just human beings that even if it didn't affect us, we should be acting.
True.
It's
Yeah.
duality. So it's both trying to get people to understand and have them just have general empathy, because that's what it's built on. And I think, like, that's part of a service I give as a Palestinian, like both showing them, and they know I'm Palestinian. So whether if they're my friend or something, they'll have it will bring them in for a certain type of reason. But I really try to bring them in on the general thing. So like when people ask me, "Oh, do you have family in Gaza?" I mean, I found out that my cousin has family in Gaza that just we found out because they evacuated, and I like to say that was a very Palestinian experience for me, because we have so much that we continuously learn because so much was destroyed. But even if we didn't, they're all our family. We're all Palestinian. And I can't imagine the suffering. We always say Gaza has given so much for Palestine. They have given the most martyrs.
Right.
It's a duty. It's just humans, even beyond our Palestinian identity, just as humans.
Yeah, I mean I think that's really important because yeah, we can obviously say on the sort of front lines of empire that the colonizers practice and perfect the tools of oppression that they will eventually bring home. And that's historically just true. And we can see it clearly that the police in the US trained in Israel, right? And that, like, I don't know, it's just becoming more and more apparent to me everywhere, like every city I go to, that they're just like shoring up a police state because it's like more and more people are disaffected and realize that the state itself in the US isn't here to serve us, which is another thing maybe we could talk about, just like because you were saying that one of the effects has been more people to understand this. But yes, like it doesn't necessarily need to be the way that we get connected through thinking like, oh, this could come for us. And for me, like one, so I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, long been an anti-Zionist Jew, but like when I think about this moment in relation to my like relationship to Judaism, Jewishness, like the thing that I like just cannot bear is the fact that people continue to like hold this Zionist position in face of just like the utter violence and destruction. And even these Zionists will like be just like relishing the barbarity of like, the soldiers and I just, it's like, I don't even know how to get past that. And like, I've seen this way before this moment, right? Like you see like settlers, not even just the soldiers, right? Like settlers, like you were saying, like having little kids come and like stone Palestinian adults, right? And like they can hide the violence through that idea that the kids aren't going to be the ones doing it. Yeah, just like that in itself should be enough to be like, this is bad. And I guess like I don't know. I'm curious in your thoughts because I've heard a lot of people say, like you said, we are all Palestinians, and I've heard people say that at at marches and like chants. And it's something I've been thinking about is like why Palestine is one of the most important first steps towards a collective liberation.
Well, I think there's so many things, and I have my own speculations on it. But I've talked about it a lot, just as we're a movement that is standing on the shoulders, especially in the United States, of other movements, the Vietnam, South Africa and BLM. And there's so many things to it. But I think like just the transition of the way Palestine has entered consciousness, through social media and so on and so forth, the nature of there being a diaspora, the nature of it being such a prolonged thing, the nature of the horror, and that you get to see that firsthand, and that people will see genocide on live stream and be like, this is fucked up, what the fuck? And, I think Palestine is very interesting because it's really like a final front for settler colonialism. And, one thing that I've read a lot about is Palestine's not only like decolonial nature, but anti-imperial nature. And so like early on, Ghassan Kanafani in his essay 1936 to 1939 Revolt, his analysis was articulating that Palestinians really understood early on that this was not just a decolonial movement. It was not just about ridding, the land of Zionist occupation, but it was about confronting the powers that are supporting that occupation, being the British Empire, being the empire largely surrounding that. And I think because of that consciousness, that also propelled the Palestinian resistance in a certain way. I mean, granted, we had Oslo, which was heavily detrimental for the Palestine struggle, but you see now with the development of, other forces at play in the Middle East that are confronting Zionism, that Zionism as a whole is really, how should I say, the realization of Palestinian liberation is through a national homeland. It is, but it doesn't mean it's a solely national thing. That, Zionism being confronted is a regional and, I mean, to this point, a global necessity. That at this moment, we're seeing every single aspect of empire focalized in one point. You see Palestinian children being murdered. You see Palestinian boys being targeted. You see Palestinian women and girls being targeted. You see elderly, neurodivergent. You see queer Palestinians being targeted through, the leaflets, as much as they love to pinkwash and so on and so forth. But the things they'll be willing to do, you're seeing every aspect of society and empire focalized against. So it's becoming really the pure genocidal violence that is willing to destroy anything. And I think in that sense, a lot of people are seeing that. And a lot of people are starting to feel, the natural humanity of themselves, but also it's the balance of it's affecting them and it's something that they're seeing that is horrific. And I mean, I've learned a lot, honestly. Some of the people have taught me the most are some of my anti-Zionist Jewish friends. One of my friends whose family who suffered under the Holocaust really helped me to articulate connections and understand, you know what I mean? Because I also like to say that we're at a very, very interesting flashpoint within the genocide. And you're seeing that Israel can't confront Palestinian resistance, that it's not achieving any of its aforementioned goals, that it's militarily is not successful on that front, that Palestinian resistance is still able to launch operations in the same sense that in Europe, when the Nazis were confronted with Jewish resistance, whether it be in the Warsaw Ghetto or any other ghetto that it was taking place, the response was collective punishment, and the response that came out to ameliorate this issue was a more, how should I say? I don't want to use the word effective, but a more almost a killing that made it so much easier for the Nazis, and in this case, it's very similar. The Zionist soldiers are getting killed on the front lines by the Palestinian resistance. And so now you see Israel taking more turns to make this killing, quote unquote, more effective by using AI. And so the way my friend and I articulated it is like, she had told me the gas chambers weren't there initially in the start of the Holocaust. That was something that came later on. And we're seeing that transition happening now. We'll see Israel go more and more in depth into the AI killing, like more and more into the starvation, more and more into these distorted killings that are really, really, what I say gets more distorted is the more separated you become. The idea that you can wipe a family off by the touch of your finger with a drone. But that means in order to facilitate that is insanity. And that insanity spreads. We saw that Israel confronted the Egyptian border, and in this like transition point is also, the point where I think, more and more people get involved because the insanity reaches like a point where you either have to become insane or it just makes you insane. So in that sense, they're confronting the Egyptians. We might see a military intervention on that point. I don't know how much that is true. I'd like to obviously see anything to put a stop to this genocide. But, in this point, who can defend? You know what I mean? Like even 8 months ago, who could defend? But it's getting worse and worse to the point where it's like you see children being burned in Rafah and their families and stuff. And it's like, people, no matter what section of society, are going to be like, what the fuck? That this is actually a genocide being shown to us live stream.
It's time for a break. We're back.
Yeah, and I've tried to bring this up with like teaching and just also like students I had at the encampment too, that what we are witnessing in Gaza is like what happened, in the conquest of the US up until like 150 years ago, right? It was like a military struggle for the US to impose its control over all of the land, right? Through violently oppressing indigenous people here who violently fought back and were like pretty successful in lots of ways, and until the like genocide shifted its tactics. But what we see in Israel is that's what colonialism needs to uphold itself, right? Is this like continual violence. And for whatever reason, like the propaganda has been so effective for many years, right? To make it seem like Israel, because of the Holocaust, usually as a reason, like needs to be there, and a kind of total dehumanization of Palestinians, like folded into a general, anti-Arab or Islamophobic sentiment. But Palestinians in particular have been targeted in this way. And I think that's interesting as you're comparing it to what actually happened in the Holocaust, because like the way that it was able to operate, I think was in part because like it wasn't visible, right? Like some people knew there was like maybe rumors, but they were like trying to hide the fact because what they were doing is like terribly shameful, right? And like totally inhuman. But this is like Israel is so brazen, and one of the most effective things has been that like people here who don't know, who hadn't learned anything about the Nakba or anything before, are seeing how terrible and violent it is. And so that's shifting people. And I talked to someone who'd been doing anti-Zionist Palestinian solidarity work for like decades. And I was like, oh, like, it's so amazing to see so many people come out now, because that, I can't imagine this 5 years ago. And like, that must be in part because of all the work that people are doing. And she's like, no, I think it's like really just Israel being so blatantly violent and terrible that more and more people are like awakening to this, which is like turning people towards having common cause with Palestinians. But what is overlooked often in this, as you were saying earlier in what you just said, is the power of the resistance itself, right? Like, we get to one stage from people having sympathy or empathy with the suffering Palestinians, but there's like another stage, and maybe this is a turning point, like you're saying, where people are like, and they're fighting back, right? And Israel is not being successful, and they're doing mass killing, but they're not wiping out Palestinians because there's a strong resistance. And that's the thing that we're not seeing as much and doesn't get talked about as much. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that in terms of like visibility of resistance and invisibility, and just the visibility of like this like terror that the state itself unleashes.
I mean, it's an interesting dynamic, the relationship between the solidarity movement and resistance. And I always tell people, like, resistance is a red line for a lot of reasons. Like, supporting the resistance is a necessity to support Palestine, because like it is the only thing standing between Palestinians and their annihilation. And it also puts an active humanizing aspect into Palestinians, that we're not just a people who are being slaughtered, but a people who are doing everything they can to stop it. And that's humanizing, and also I say the resistance is the red line because if you support it's the only thing that can't get co-opted. You know what I mean? Like, you can't co-opt the resistance. And in that sense, you really are investing yourselves in Palestinian liberation, in what it really means in the full, like, liberation by Palestinians. And that's something I have issue with. When I read a lot about, the Holocaust, in our schools, we didn't read much about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that, Jews resisted the Nazis, that people resisted. And in that sense, like, we're all, in terms of colonized people, we're not just people who suffer, but active participants and agents in our lives and get those choices. And so it is an interesting dynamic the way it works in the United States. Like, I really hope it gets more and more, because you can't accept a left politics without accepting, the Palestinian armed struggle, and their capacity to resist. But I mean, it's a process, because, obviously with the line of the resistance taking an Islamic turn, like, Islamophobia is so weaponized, on that front. This idea that, especially now that it's Pride Month, I think the idea is, like, people say, oh, well, Queers for Palestine. If you were in Gaza, you'd get thrown off a building. And I'd be like, no, I think you'd get killed by a bomb from Israel. Right. This idea, this kind of language against resistance, and that somehow a bunch of barbarians. And then the whole, like, Hamas ISIS thing, which is insanity. The idea that many resistance factions, whether in Palestine and Lebanon, actually have to deal with ISIS as a thorn in their ass. And then we obviously had the beheaded babies, the mass rape propaganda. But, you could see it early on that it was embedded in racist tropes of barbarism and savagery. That this insurgency, and I mean, facing the counterinsurgency propaganda, but this insurgency is only capable of blind violence. And that's where I come back. And I always try to tell people, like, in order for them to better understand resistance, that resistance is not just revenge. Like, it's totally justified for Palestinians to be angry at facing, genocide, like, that is entirely justified. But Palestinians are still more than that. That resistance is deeply logical and deeply rational. You see just the level of, like, confrontation, that goes on, these operations that are deeply, like, militarily tactical, whether it be coming from southern Lebanon, stuff like that there's no, like, escalations are moderated in order to have the most effect and preserve, because Israel and the United States, they want a hot, fast war of destruction, destroy everything. It's just this genocidal violence, whereas you're seeing on the other side, like, resistance is the rational actor that is playing and engaging in this war of attrition. And it's working because, Israel hasn't been able to do anything. It's been able to murder people. It's been able to slaughter in mass children. But what else? At the cost of one, like you said, the propaganda machine. Everyone's like, well, what the fuck, Israel? Like, this is disgusting. And two, like, no material gains. That's the violence has been revealed. The settler colonial project has been revealed. And so we'll have to see. Like, I do have faith and I try my best, to hope that, the American public will become more and more conscious and supportive of resistance. Because, like I said, it's a deeply humanizing thing. It's deeply humanizing to recognize someone not only as someone that suffers, but someone that is an agent in their life. And that's part of real love. Like, we always say that, like, on if we bring it down to an individual basis, like, you don't love someone because they just do what you want. You love someone for them and what they do and their agency and stuff like that. And really loving a colonized people, loving Palestinians, means sticking by them in what they choose. That's what solidarity is. We're here by them. They're standing for themselves. Like, they're leading the way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's super important. Just like even on an interpersonal level, like the best thing you can do for someone is allow them to to let them be, right? Even if that means letting them go and do something you don't like, right? Like, you can't control that. And I think it's really important what you said, because the way that history is typically told about even all these like terrible things, even for people who have sympathy for the suffering of people who've been harmed, has been a story where like the oppressed people, the powerless people, like, are led like lambs to the slaughter. But the truth is that in every instance of mass oppression, there's been very strong resistance. It's like obviously helpful that there's this long history, centuries, of like Islamophobia that or Orientalism or whatever that portrays Arabs and Muslims as barbarous, which is like totally does a lot of service to hide the barbarity of the West. And the fact that like Hamas, right, like, is this like, stands in for the Islamic terrorists, the authoritarian rule. And I mean, I think it's just like, people don't understand that, like, that it's just one vector in the force of resistance that's probably not really widely popular, because no one really is going to like be like, yes, we want to be under an authoritarian rule, right? But it just does a lot of service, obviously, for Israel and for the US to defend their violence.
And I think, there's like a multitude of it. And like Hamas is interesting because, I mean, there's a lot, but effectively they have the mantle of resistance, but now it's not like just, again, Hamas. Like,
right.
And even if it was, like, what we like to say in Palestine is like resistance, both like resistance, like you look at the PLO, like the PLO was a huge thing, but then it stopped resisting,
right.
what I mean? Like, gave that up. And so now it's an existential thing. And this idea that they're, I see Western leftists are like, oh my God, Islamism. Da, 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 da. It's like, well, the communists in Palestine are fighting with the Islamists. This idea that, and Islamism is such a weaponized term that it can mean so many different things. You have ISIS, which is referred to as Islamist, but effectively clashes with other resistance, like Palestinian resistance factions. ISIS, which serves, and a lot of times American imperialism. These words are just weaponized and diluted as a means against Palestinians.
Right.
They love to use the word authoritarian or things like that against, not only just against Palestinian resistance, but largely in the Middle East. As if, the president of the United States didn't just call SWAT into Columbia's campus, that's the like insanity of it all.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think it's important to talk about that, or I don't know, maybe not to talk about, but like that there's like forces of resistance that we can't see, that we don't know, and that's, I think, powerful too, because the attention on one thing can allow for other people to be doing many different things. And it's just one of the ways that I think we like, because of how we're told these stories and history is told, that we always simplify it to be like, these are the actors in this moment, but it's actually usually way more complicated. It also like goes back to like this kind of settler perspective, which is like that the only thing that they can imagine resistance leading to is like, wanton revenge and violence.
No, and that's what I say. Like, the violence of the occupier is always from a stance of either maintaining that system, and comes from a stance of fear of what is not real. You know what I mean? You look at like settler fear, and it's like just this, I almost say sometimes their own fantasies, them fearing that happening onto them, but it's never real. It's never the material experience in front of their faces. But whereas like in the colonized, the oppressed, the occupied, they're resisting. Like every use of violence is tactical for their resistance. It's tactical for their existence. A lot of people say existence is resistance, but I like to always say resistance is existence. You know what I mean? It's the thing that stands in the way of annihilation. And it's funny too, because like, you know, in the West and so many places, everyone's like peace and love, non-violence would get the way. But it's like the resistance is always slandered as being suicidal. But the level to which non-violence is like insane and suicidal in a lot of ways, like I think I don't know how true this is, but someone told me like Gandhi had a communique with someone in Europe at the start of the Holocaust. And that they asked Gandhi, what do we do? And then Gandhi suggested that a lot of Jewish people just do mass suicide in order to get the world to be like, what the fuck? But effectively, like the Great March of Return in Palestine was an instance where Palestinians went unarmed, and it was a mass like slaughter. And did anything change? Like absolutely nothing. That really like this mantra is suicidal.
We can't control like also all these energies of resistance. And I think that's what's scary for people, like even, you know, especially maybe even leftists who want to support, but then they're like, oh, is it okay if I support this? And like, I don't know, like the pathway to liberation is going to go through lots of different unpredictable things. Some of them will probably be bad. Some of them will be good, right? Like, and I don't think there's any other way to kind of go through this. We don't have the sort of like formula that's going to work in advance. I love the point you bring up also just about the settler imagination of violence that as a basically an excuse or to kind of precede their violence, because also like the thing that's been maybe most troubling for me, you know, besides the mass death, is like the relish that people have of the violence of Israel, and also and the counter protesters at these encampments have been so disgusting, because they're like just like what they're cheering on is like just like the worst possible thing, and to watch people be excited and proud of that is like disgusting.
Yeah, it's not even just like the idea that, you know, there's this mantra of like, oh, they don't know what's going on. It's like, no, like you see people saying like horrific things where they know exactly what they're saying. Like I think there was someone around here who said they're going to learn Arabic to support the killing of Palestinian children. You know, it's just like abhorrent shit.
Yeah.
And you're like, what the fuck? Or like just sexual obscenities to, you know, the students in the encampment or things like that. Or like, I think at Columbia, I just saw like some woman like yell at the students, like, I hope you get raped. Like what, I don't know what their fantasy with, you know, sexual violence is. It keeps coming up, but it's like, yeah, I mean, to that point, it's just like, it's fucking gross. You know, it's insane. And like this ideology is just like disgusting. You know what I mean?
There's this one guy in New York who's like always just like, he'll like take aside anyone who's like he thinks is queer and just start yelling at them about how they would be dead in houses, right?
It's so funny the way like their own homophobia comes out. Like there's a bunch of memes on Twitter. It's like, oh, the minute someone who's queer supports Palestine, it's a Zionist just saying rabidly homophobic shit. Right. And it's the same thing, like why I bring back like Zionism. It focalizes every single form of hatred into one, like even anti-Semitism. You know, like you look at how far many Zionists go to do Holocaust revisionism to serve this colonial means, but also like I see some of my Jewish friends who are like proudly anti-Zionist. They're like, you're not a Jew, like call them a capo or something like that, and just say like, oh, you have to go back to, like, we should have left you in Europe, or some like just horrific shit like that.
Yeah, it's really terrible. I mean, so to get back to the encampments a little bit, because like, I mean, this has been great, but I want to like also like get some of your insight there, because I think these connections really important. You know, when we're talking about the lengths that they're willing to go with violence, both, you know, Israel and the US, it's about upholding these like this like idea of land as property, it seems, right? Like that that Israel can own Palestine. And that's clear, like one of the parallels in the encampments has been that like these schools are massive property holders, but also just the threat of young people and intergenerational connections, like being like, this land can be used to a different purpose than what you want, seems to be one of the things that calls out violence. So I wonder if you have thoughts on just like the kind of spatiality of the encampments. And also maybe another question I keep having is like what the relationship of the encampments is to settler colonialism here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And like the way I was talking with my friend last night. It was just a loose articulation when we were talking about Fanon. But I was just like saying like settler colonialism goes after the indigenous population insofar as the indigenous population is tied to the land in a way that the primacy of everything is the land. An indigenous way, it's a very like nurturing, healthy relationship. And settler colonialism and capitalism need the land for its exploitation. And insofar as the indigenous population is tied to that land, they must be exploited or slaughtered, because of that. And so you're seeing like that obviously take place in Palestine. But what's interesting is here, like the encampment is a way of like, kind of returning to, I don't want to say returning to the land. Like, I don't want to say it's coming from my words, but it was so beautiful to see that, different indigenous groups in the United States, that the students are welcome on this land, and that's what the student encampment, especially within our context, because I know there's different contexts, there's the more tactical use of the encampment. And this is a very holistic use, which comes with its own caveats and so on and so forth. But you're seeing students like really learn community in a space that like is not just tied to capital and land exploitation, that like people are making the most of the space that they have now. And that's so abysmally threatening to the university, because like if you normalize that, you normalize these students, they're not going to listen, they're not going to need to listen to these like institutions to which they're coerced. And you're seeing like a real revolutionary politic be developed with a lot of these organizers in the camp, that like they're learning things, they're learning it. And like for me, like I've learned a lot. Like I got evicted from my apartment because it was on campus, and I got banned from campus, and I had to just like learn, as much as it's just a sliver, just a tiny amount of that. I just had to learn to figure out before I had a place to stay. Like I had to learn to like where to go, like what to do with my stuff, like things like that. And you're giving like students a window into that. I always say like everyone will face repression. Like repression is really hard. Granted, we know obviously repression is not the same. The repression is not the same as full-blown genocide. But repression, I think what people miss out when they say repression is hard is it sounds really off-putting. But it's like when you really like return yourself to the land, when you return yourself to liberation, when you return yourself to these, these practices, these like that are outside the fold of capitalism, in as much as they can be, it is refreshing. It feels amazing, to be invested in something that, is present, is grounded. And so like in that sense, so many of these students can weather the repression because they're grounding themselves in the land, they're grounding themselves in the encampment, they're grounding themselves in liberation and honoring indigenous people in Palestine and here. A lot of my friends happen here to be indigenous, and it's a back and forth, like teaching each other.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, one of the things, I mean, the thing that honestly excited me the most when the encampment started popping off was that they involved a creation of like a different organization of daily life within these spaces, because I was just starting to just feel like we were not getting anywhere in marches, like, and just like the fact that I know that we're never going to be successful in demanding that the US politicians like give a shit, right? Like, and stop and do anything to stop this. Like they might do the most minimal sort of superficial things, but like they're not going to, because the US empire is tied up in Israel. So the encampments, which like obviously were like touched a vein, were just really exciting because it was a different tactic than marching, different tactic than chanting and like demanding, although that was used too within the encampments. And then I had students who had firsthand experience for the first time that we're doing anarchism, right? We're like doing this thing. And I think that's like really important to pair with the other thing that you were talking about, is like that people are awakening to the brute violence, right? It's like interesting to put these things hand in hand, where like the encampments are subjected to violence. And it's also very telling that you were evicted from the encampment and also from the property of the university. But it's subjected to violence, but also there's the beauty of this life in together. And I just wonder, I wonder if you have thoughts just on how those two sides, like the violence and the kind of beauty and I don't know, creating safety together. Like I was thinking when you said that people would bring their families there. So like they also want to use the violence to dissuade people from participating, but like there's something happening there that's welcoming other people regardless.
Yeah. And I think this is where it's becoming really popular. And I mean popular in the sense of this community, because obviously the student movement is leading the way, but the idea is that we're just one aspect in a larger solidarity movement, that this is for more than just students. This is for everyone. And, like I said, like you have this like psychosocial transformation when both engaging in your praxis and the theory and when engaging in your principles and your praxis of, this fulfillment, this ability to weather the storm, to weather the repression. It is fulfilling. It is the thing. And like a Palestinian revolutionary was martyred in 2017 from the town that I spent time in, El Bira. His name is Basil Al-Araj. He said like resistance is both an escape and a confrontation of reality. That it's an escape in the sense that, it's affirming the human need for heroes and romanticism and this creation in a way that is able to confront the material reality and, is both fulfilling and has material effects. And, obviously, this is just a smidge compared to, what Palestinian resistance is doing, but it's its own form of resistance. That, like you said, resistance takes so many different tactics. It's not just, these armed factions, but it's the doctors that are in Palestine that are doing everything they can. It's the people who are entertaining the children in Palestine. It's all of these different things, and resistance takes so many different angles. And so in that sense, like people here are both confronting the material conditions of their reality. Material conditions in the sense that their institutions are supporting genocide. Right. Their institutions, based on varying degrees within this person, based on varying degrees, might already be subject to empire. And they're confronting it through the lens of, beauty and culture and escape, like the unifying aspect. Like Palestine is really the North Star right now, that Palestine, people are learning about Palestine, adopting, some of these things on behalf of Palestine. And that being fulfilling, and that bringing in everyone, that bringing in the community, that bringing in these kids who are, we had these the other day, we had these like young little kids who were chanting on the microphone, free Palestine, you know what I mean? And that just like the essence of, what this stands for, popular movement for Gaza, popular university, a new space, a new university for those that don't want to serve empire, because it's just simple. Like so many of these classes at school, what the fuck do you learn? Like finance? Oh, fuck off. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a beautiful point too, that like, it's like within the space of resistance that the possibility of this other kind of flourishing occurs. And the encampments have been these locations of really creative, innovative ways of like learning together, studying together, making art, doing like beautiful music, praying together, like spirituality, things that wouldn't be possible without having to confront the act of resistance, because we're divided from each other in all these ways. I like the way that you are kind of tying those things together. I think that's really important. I'm wondering, just since your encampment is like so long standing compared to like a lot of the other ones which have been ended in various ways, like what do you think is the path forward? And also like how does the like material fact of the encampment and its continuation relate to the demands that like are sort of the reasoning for being there?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a multitude of things. Like the plan forward is still like kind of being figured out along the way. It's both an assessment, a reassessment, and a moving forward. Like again, tying to like you said, like what is the best way to further our demands? And in this sense, it's really furthering our demands in the sense that like maybe not immediately, but in the sense that it's really a site of building, a site of community building, and also a site of like initiating other fronts, because there's a multitude of fronts coming in that like students are now witnessed what happened and they are now more engaged. Faculty witnessed what happened and they are now more engaged. Grad students witnessed what happened and they now are more engaged. And again, it's like we're at a difficult point. We're in the summer. There's not a lot of people here, but like learning this encampment, like right now, we're learning a lot of different things of like how might we be hit by different tactics of repression, like how do we weather our own things, because I'm sure every encampment had this issue at one point or not, but like learning how to navigate leadership in a space where you guys are the leaders, you guys are effectively what control is going on, You know what I mean? And I think like so much of us, especially like students of color, students from colonized backgrounds, queer students, like they're holding in the psychological trauma of their existence, and coming out in a space where they're in control. Like you have to learn to navigate your own experiences and stuff like that. And that can be like, that obviously comes with like struggle and so on and so forth, but it can be super great because you really learn more about yourself and how to best organize and how to move forward on your demands. You know what I mean? You learn to orient yourself in the struggle for your demands for moving forward.
I mean, to me, yeah, that's like a really interesting point. And to me, that's like sort of what anarchism is like you don't like have a blueprint, but you like figure out what to do in the moment with the people you're with and the conditions as they change. And I had, coming into the encampments, I had seen in New York in particular, it felt like the solidarity movement had really been run by orgs, whether they're nonprofits or parties or groups. And the encampments were sort of a relief from that, like, because like the organizations like didn't have control within that spot. They might have been influencing and inspiring people, but then the students are there, right? And like a friend of mine who is at Columbia, when I asked like, oh, like is, PSL coming in and trying to impose their ideas, she was like, actually just like the material fact of how an encampment works really lends itself to this horizontal organizing and like autonomous groups doing what they want, but linked together. It doesn't allow for a kind of hierarchy to come and impose itself in that way. But I obviously have heard in other schools too that there has been trouble around hierarchies and like leaders. And also like I've heard a lot about from different students in different encampments that they've crumbled along identity fractures, like where people are like, oh, like this kind of person can only do this kind of thing, or you got to listen to this person no matter what they say because of their background. So I wonder like how you might have confronted any of these possibilities if they did come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think every encampment, and I've heard from my friends, like we all had like little moments of these, like identity and so on and so forth. But it's really like, again, I always say like being grounded helps you to navigate. Like it's no less difficult, but like I I conceptualize the encampment as a front. And so I remember talking with a mentor of mine, like Palestinian. He said, like, what is a front? He's like, a front has to be ideologically disciplined, but a front will never be ideologically pure. This is a myth,
Right.
And that a front has multiple angles. It has multiple sides. Like it's not just one. You have multiple fronts, and when a front push forward, those who are not there must, are forced behind it. Confront that horizon. And I conceptualize the encampment as the opening of a new front, an effective front, whereas others had kind of hit walls. This kind of flood, where the water seeps through and people from other places are forced into the stream, and by moving that forward, you weren't having, like you have certain bottlenecks, but you weren't having the same bottlenecks in other contexts, like you said, like was other groups coming in to impose their leadership. Like, no, that was not materially possible. I mean, it could have been, but it wouldn't have been like, it would have been so like restrictive that it would have just not been worth it. So you're seeing like the opening of the new front and this new flood come in, and that guiding other factions in an autonomous, like fluid way. Again, Basil al-Araj always says fluidity. And yeah, and that's like, that is what I conceptualize it as. It's this new thing that people were forced behind. For a good reasons. It's not like, people didn't want to get behind it, but because it was the opening a new horizon, opening a new front, that's what it led to.
Right. It was unpredictable, and like it had been brewing for a while, specifically at Columbia, but like then it was unleashed in this way that spread, and like there was no way that people were sitting around like knowing that would happen. And I think it I was thinking about this as you were speaking, like it created another possibility of the experience of solidarity here, because I think we keep hitting a wall, whether it's the wall of the police or the wall of our separation. Yeah, other forms of like feeling that we don't have the power of how in this land we can be in solidarity with people who are undergoing this like terrible genocide and also resisting it, right? Like, because we feel often so cut off in that way. But it seemed to me that the encampments allowed for another thinking of what that solidarity could look like and mean.
Yeah, and just on an emotional level, because you were seeing in Gaza, like students coming out and saying like thank you,
Right.
you know, for that. And also just like a material level, like the encampments had a material effect, like whether that be like mass mobilizing, but also like the munitions stopped, it restarted, but US stopped its munitions in the heat of the encampment. And just knowing that aspect is a really important takeaway.
Yeah. I wonder, did you just, since there have been so many different places, were you in communication with other encampments? Did you learn from other people's like experiences? Have people there like written or shared their ideas?
Yeah, I have a lot of friends just like by the nature of, Palestine organizing, but I was monitoring different schools and stuff like that. And it's interesting, like different schools were similar. Like Texas and like Ohio, like these red states, we all had a pretty similar experience, like really quick state troopers, or just forceful thing. But whereas like in like UCLA, they had a huge violence, but also like they had the front of the Zionist agitators, which we had, and there was obviously a concern about that, but it took a different turn. It didn't get to UCLA level, and I think that's because our city is siloed. It's really just the school, I should say.
Right.
Whereas, we also had the psychological aspect of like police were revving the engine in the middle of the night to like keep people up. Whereas in like Michigan, like I had heard them the same things because Michigan was up for 30 days before they had a raid. They didn't get that immediate stuff. And so they had to experience a lot of that psychological stuff for a long time. And it's unifying because you learn from each other. You learn different ways to confront different things. I think one of the worst things is what we called music terrorism. So the Zionists had like 8 speakers and played EDM like all day.
Yeah.
It was like abysmal.
Yeah.
It was so bad. It was so goofy. But that's like, it's this like give and take. I mean, and now effectively, like every campus has had a police, or not every single campus. If they stayed up, like most of them have had a police raid. You know what I mean? And that's too, like we're all experiencing that. Like I just think about that, and that's like changed the landscape. The police are just like, all right, we're gonna raid.
Right.
You know,
I mean, it's like in a way that's similar to the George Floyd rebellions because like it was a new crop of people to face like immediate police repression for something that people felt was just. And I think it's the same thing here when new people getting involved through encampments, going through that experience. Although sometimes I'm like, well, we've got a really robust jail support organization and infrastructure now, but like I don't want people to get arrested or beaten by the police. So I don't know. I keep getting kind of stuck on that wall because like they can overwhelm us so easily, right? But yeah, I don't know.
no, yeah, I mean it's hard, and it's like interesting the way like arrests in different contexts go differently. Like here we had to deal with like a ban. Like it was just like in Minnesota had that problem too. Granted, it got rescinded because it was like totally like what the fuck is this? You know what I mean? But like the legal aspect being a very important front in of itself. And I think people are learning to like because before people were kind of detached from Palestine, like people were engaged, but like you said, like people felt like detached because there was like these ceilings of just mass protests and stuff like that. Like it wasn't like going as far. And so I think people felt the like idea that like, ooh, getting arrested, like, oh, that's interesting. But like people learning that like it's not like you don't want these just like arrests for no reason. The
Right.
symbol was that like you want to really just be doing what you can do most, and like learning that from getting arrested has like changed the level of the game.
Yeah, I find myself resistant to any moment where they're like, we just need bodies and we need people to get arrested. I'm like, what? No, and one of the things I thought that was actually powerful about the encampments was that even though a lot of them had a ton of people, they could be effective in smaller groups. Whereas like marches often depend on their power and being a lot of people there, and so it can like wax and wane with like participation. But I don't know. I mean, like, sounds like your encampment has been pretty well populated.
Yeah, I mean, it's varied. It's varied because there's also like not, and I think it will develop more, but there's not really many anti-imperial or like revolutionary orgs on our campus.
Right.
And that like that's a wild card, that you could bring a bunch of people in, but also like you might have low numbers. And I think we've learned how to navigate that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like we don't even know what's going to sprout from here, but a lot of people will have learned so much and like will develop new ideas through it. even if it's like changes in the direction it goes, like away from campuses somewhere else. But yeah, I mean, do you have any other ideas or thoughts or anything you want to make sure that you say? Because I think we've like covered a lot, and you've said a lot of really insightful and beautiful things. So I just want to make sure if there's anything else you want to put out there.
No, I mean, I don't think there's anything I think we both know like it's the genocide still going on, you know what I mean? And that's like I always tell people too, like we're like a lot of people are saying like all eyes on Rafah, but like it's more than that, you know what I mean? Like no matter where you are, what institution you are, you can do something. Like whether you're in a certain institution that can help with GoFundMe's, whether you're in your school, you can get involved with Palestine groups, whether you're in your community and you can like educate yourself and be ready. And I tell people like in the event that like the movement in your locale is not very hot right now, like what is just as equally valuable to your participation is your readiness, you know, for the moment that it does. And that's I guess that's usually what I leave on a lot of fronts. And I don't know, it's been a very good conversation and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for all of your perspective. And yeah, I think you just like brought up some of the most important points. And I think like, yeah, focusing on these fights of resistance so that we don't despair at the idea that the overwhelming power is against us, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for all that you're doing out there. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Thank you for listening to The Breakup Theory. Please rate and follow this podcast, share it with your friends and exes, and support us on Patreon if you want. We would love to hear from you, so please write or call us. Until then, I will talk with you next time.